Before we start, I want to bring up, does anyone notice that Doctor Strange basically has the same accent as House MD? Like, maybe I obsessively watch too much House. I understand that both characters are basically like British dudes playing brilliant doctors, but do they have the same dialect coach?
Because I do not believe in fairy tales about chakras or energy. We are made of matter and nothing more.
Which is why Arceus created a universe with 3 states of matter and 300 solid and liquid poisons.
So Multiverse of Madness came out and is now available for streaming. My Steelbook from Best Buy should be coming around like Tuesday or so. I'm really disappointed they didn't go with that one that has Wanda coming up from the earth, like the Evil Dead reference. I've now seen the movie twice. Probably by the time I finish editing this, I'll have seen it 3 times to get all the clips for it. And I thought it was a really fun movie, especially for an MCU movie. Like, it was campy at times, yeah, and that's kind of the point, which is good because there was some really jarring CGI scenes, and because of the tone of the movie, it didn't really feel bad. It didn't feel like it took me out of the moment. It kind of reminds me of a Robert Rodriguez movie, like specifically Spy Kids. Like, yeah, the thumbs look bad, but that's kind of the point because, they don't really exist and it's part of how ridiculous it is. It's part of the charm. And by charm, I mean overworked and underpaid visual effects artists who are abused and under constant crunch from Disney, and they're not allowed to unionize like every other aspect of the film industry, because then Disney will threaten to be like, we'll send your work to an Indian bot farm over there. So yeah, see, then no one has a job here, Charm. Like, I personally don't mind bad CGI, but facts are facts. I really like Wanda's fall from grace in this movie. Like, basically, she is the horror monster in this horror movie. She's come a long way from the scared kid in Civil War, which is weird. Which is weird to say because Wanda's supposed to be like 28 in WandaVision and in this movie, which is like the age that I'm at. And like, thinking back to like Civil War, like 2016, yeah, I absolutely was a kid. But now I'm an adult with adult things, and I'm sure that 5 years from now or 7 years from now, I'll look back at myself now and be like, yeah, I was a kid. But that's an existential horror for another day. And I mentioned horror twice because if you couldn't tell, this is a horror movie. And Mr. Sam Raimi, director of the Evil Dead movies, who was 20 when he made those, he understood the assignment and put some like really good camp in the MCU. Originally, Scott Derrickson, the director of the first Doctor Strange movie, was going to direct it, but creative differences, aka he didn't like being controlled, and then he backed out. And then they went to Sam Raimi, and then Sam Raimi was like, I'm going to do some weird shit. Now, an unpopular opinion, but I actually really like Doctor Strange's character development in this movie. Like, he gets to show off some really cool magic, and in the first movie, he goes from a control freak who learns to let go and put himself on the line for the greater good. But in this movie, he learns that, like, okay, just because I can fight phenomenal cosmic beings and I have phenomenal cosmic power doesn't mean that I am an island. I still have to let people in. And he learns to being like an emotionally guarded person to let people in. And overall, the question of are you happy hits a little too close to home, and I am sure I will get into that with my new therapist whenever I find one, whenever I can figure out insurance. Benedict Wong really gets a shine as Sorcerer Supreme, and I'm really happy with the Asian representation that we've seen in Phase 4 so far. Like, Phase 4 with Shang-Chi brought back martial arts movies, but also Benedict Wong in this role, also Gilgamesh in the Eternals, both of them being absolute tanks that can hold their own and fight, and no one would dare make a fat joke. And if there was something else I'm forgetting, I feel like I'm forgetting somebody from this movie. Oh, right, America Chavez is in this movie too. I say it like that because to say I'm disappointed would be putting it lightly. She spends so much of this movie just being a prop, just being a MacGuffin, a damsel in distress, kind of a recurring theme with Sam Raimi and his superhero movies. She's just such a passive character, just reacting to things that happen to her, and half of the time that she's on the screen, you could replace her with a book of spells or a portal gun, and it would not change the plot in any meaningful way. Part of me gets it because Benedict Cumberbatch is a Shakespearean-trained actor. Like, he is very good at his job, and Elizabeth Olsen really shines in a performance in this movie. Like, her performance really carries it and makes me really like it and gives it that rewatchability. But like, if you're not going to share the spotlight, if you're not going to really use all of your pieces to their full potential, why have her there at all? Benedict Wong is underutilized, but he still has moments that he gets to shine. Now, I'll admit that I am a fan of the America Chavez comics, and I haven't really read that much Doctor Strange, so I went into this with a little bit of a bias, but I also understand that MCU changes characters all the time, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, like we're going to talk about in this video. So I really wasn't expecting like a one-to-one thing, and I shouldn't. You shouldn't expect like things to be a one-to-one recreation. But man, a lot of the things that changed, I was like, man, I didn't think you could change it and mess it up that bad. But, you know, here we are. Now, if you're not familiar with her, let's go into a little bit of a background in America Chavez in the comics. America Chavez debuted in 2013, an Afro-Latina with super strength, flight, and the ability to punch portals into different universes. Typical girly things. A sassy, headstrong, and flexed responsibility with sarcasm. She ends up being one of the Young Avengers and all their teams going around until finally, until 2017, she has her own solo run where she is introduced as being from a different universe, specifically called the Utopian Parallel. While in the parallel, her moms sacrifice themselves and she decides that she wants to become the best version of herself. And in order to do that, she has to leave her home and go off into different universes and develop her power, develop her strength. She shows up in New York and then travels around different Latin American countries, and basically becoming and adopting the culture, learning how to become a human from these cultures. She becomes best friends with Kate Bishop. She leads the Young Avengers and some other teams, all while doing some quips and always wanting a cafecito and speaking in really cringy Spanglish. In 2021, they retcon her origin story to be that her moms were always from Earth and her powers came as a result of medical experiment, and she actually has Graves' disease. And to cure her from her illness, her mom subjected her to these medical experiments by this eccentric billionaire on this island called the Utopian Parallel. And because subtlety is dead, they made sure the title of this comic is called Made in the USA. God, I love comics. I don't want to stay too long in this because I'm not a good comic historian, but I do want to point out that in this retcon, they change America's origin to where she grew up in Washington Heights. So she has a very specific relationship with New York, very much like Spider-Man has with New York. The Santanas found her on the beach and they raised her because they didn't want her to be a part of the foster care system, which is notorious for being bad. They took her in as one of their own. And just like in the original story, she leaves New York because she wants to become the best version of herself. That's when she goes on her adventures. That's when she joins the Avengers. And New York is very much a found home for her. So leaving that is not easy. And so while, yes, she has, as the story develops, a complicated relationship with New York, it still is a relationship with New York, period. Keep that in mind. Now, the portrayal wasn't all bad. There are some things that I like in this movie, and I think there are lots of salvageable moments that we can use moving forward into the future that we are stuck with. First of all, the actress, Xochitl Gomez, is super likable, and all of the problems that I have are with the writing and with the executive decisions. I have no beef with her personally. She's super nice and she's getting that Disney money, and I wish her all of the success in the world. When she's allowed to emote in the movie, she seems like she's having fun, and if you watch the interviews, she's really happy to be here. And I don't know how old America in the movie is supposed to be, but I know that they aged her down, and I can see her growing into the role, especially with Young Avengers being all but confirmed. The really cringy Spanglish from the comics translates just as well from the comics as it does to on screen.
Adios.
Which is a weird monkey paw wish for comic book accuracy. Like, listen, I'm not the biggest fan, but if it gets our foot in the door and it leads to more representation to where we can eventually leave it behind, I'm all for it. Also, like I mentioned before, Kate Bishop and America Chavez are best friends in the comic. And I can see this actress vibing and meshing very well with Haley Steinfeld, who is Hawkeye in the new Hawkeye series. Especially the way they both deal with their mentors being closed off and in diners. I can see these two forming the relationship that they tell us that Hawkeye and Black Widow are supposed to have. Finally, I think they did a decent job of not completely messing up the foundation of her character. Like, she's obviously going to come back. Like I mentioned before, Young Avengers is all but confirmed with all the other characters lined up in all the other parts. One of the good things about the MCU is that they create so much content that they can just slowly but surely change her character a little bit here and there until eventually she's just a shadow of her former self.
Adios.
The best thing is the audience will accept it. They'll be like, oh yeah, America was always this cool. Like, was she? I'll remember. One aspect of her story that I will say that I'm sincerely interested in is what they're going to do with her origin. Like, in the memory lane part of the movie, she doesn't say that's the Utopian Parallel. She says it's home. And I feel like that was a very deliberate choice. And I do wonder if they're going to give her the extraterrestrial origin, or if they're gonna make it so that she was always on the MCU universe. So again, as a comics fan, in that aspect, you have my curiosity. you have yet to get my attention. Which, speaking of, let's talk about the things I did not like. I had to get my glasses because there's a lot to say here that I need to get right. So now, for the most part, MCU does a pretty good job of making all of their stories self-contained. Like, they don't want to alienate people who haven't seen all 20 movies and at this point like 5 or 10 shows. Like, so they want the money. So they're going to do their best to make everything pretty standalone so that you don't really need to see everything else. Even in this movie, Multiverse of Madness, like, it assumes that you've seen WandaVision, but you really don't need to have seen it to understand it. You might need it to get the full range of emotions and what she's experiencing, but it's not hard to understand, honestly. However, the time that they have done it, the MCU, especially recently, has done a really bad job of making people excited for spinoff. Like Maya Lopez, who is Echo from the Hawkeye show. She is getting her own spinoff show. And the Hawkeye show did a really good job of not making me care. At least from the show's perspective, from a character perspective. I personally am excited because I'm excited to see a deaf indigenous actor get their own show and like mainline a show. But if I didn't know that the actor was indigenous, that if I didn't know that they were deaf, I didn't know that they were actually disabled, like, and that they worked around that disability and made it an integral part of their character, I really wouldn't care. I would just be like, oh, she's getting her own show. Good for her. And then move on with my day. And that's kind of how I feel here, where if I didn't really know America Chavez from the comics, if I wasn't so starved for representation, I wouldn't be making this video, to be quite honest. If we had an abundance of representation, if we didn't have a history of what I'm about to talk about, then this video would not be necessary. But it is, because most people aren't going to go through their lives not knowing the damage that has been done. Which brings me to really my biggest problem with the characterization, which is the black erasure of America Chavez. Now, the MCU already has an established history of whitewashing characters and not only changing them, but also erasing their heritage. Which is really funny because the biggest example of this is the antagonist of this movie, Wanda Maximoff. They kind of just doubled down on erasing her Jewish and Romani heritage as part of her identity. Even though literally this movie is called Multiverse of Madness. So like if there is any movie where you could fix it, it would be this one. I'm not going to harp on this for too long on Wanda's erasure. There's been plenty of videos on it. Other creators like Danielle Silverstone on TikTok have like talked in depth about really the damage of this. So me not being Romani or Jewish does not feel right to really go into too much. So I'll leave that for the better people. Now, in the comics, America is tall, muscular, openly queer, and, oh yeah, black. In case you didn't know, Latina people can be black too. Specifically, she's Puerto Rican. Even before her retcon, she was very heavily coded to be Puerto Rican. While the actress herself, Xochitl Gomez, is Mexican. They even show a bedazzled skull on the back of her jacket, which, honestly, all of this really feels like petty revenge for Jennifer Lopez playing Selena.
Adios.
No, I said earlier that I'd be willing to forgive cringy Spanglish if it meant getting more representation on screen. But the thing is, we can't keep doing the same old thing. I want a more diverse representation on the screen, especially if we're going to be mixing nationalities with Latina people like that.
This is a square. Can you guess which spot that goes in? That's right. It goes in the square hole. And how about this rectangle? That one, that goes in there too.
And the thing is, Xochitl looks exactly like what a non-Latina person would imagine when they hear the name Chavez. And that's the biggest problem with it. Funny enough, we do have an Afro-Latina in the MCU. Zoe Saldana, who plays Gamora in Guardians of the Galaxy, who you might know as Zoe Saldana. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie, it shocked me. I knew before I made this video, but I was shocked to find out that she was Latina. She lived in the Dominican Republic. Her mom was Puerto Rican. Like, she removed the Enya from her actor's name, which is its own separate letter in Spanish. And she did it to be able to get more roles in Hollywood. There's also a thing about how when you're filling out forms on websites, they don't allow you to put in a special character like a tilde or an Enya. And it's part of it is because the developers don't know how to account for foreign names because they probably don't know any foreign people, or their bosses don't know any foreign people, but that's neither here nor there. That's just my engineering background coming in. Literally, as I'm reading the script, Microsoft Word is telling me that I misspelled Zoe Saldana's name. Like, because I dared to have a foreign character in this. And the correct suggestion is to remove the Enya. But Zoe, even though she is Afro-Latina, she's painted green the entire time that she's on screen. She's literally an alien in a galaxy far, far away. Which she was also an Avatar, which I don't know if I didn't know because she was blue or because Avatar is just that forgettable. But regardless, she's in 3 of the 5 highest grossing movies of all time. And in none of them can her character be Latina because her character isn't coded in any which way that would signify to us, the audience, that she is this certain way. She's painted in all of these, her blackness literally being erased. Now, this is the argument that people try to make for America Chavez being erased from any kind of representation. They were trying to erase her Latinidad. They were trying to erase her blackness because she is an alien. She's an extraterrestrial being or whatever. And it is the biggest driving force behind the 2021 retcon. But even before the retcon, she was still raised in that culture. She still speaks and presents a certain way to that culture. And while there is a validity to the fact that we don't need to code anymore because we can just openly present, there's no haze code, there's no censorship, which debatable, yeah, but it definitely is better than it was before. There's still some validity to being subtle and being able to code so that these characters are just allowed to exist and just have the story be about them and not have to be about any trauma or any negative connotation that are associated with that certain thing. I really don't think I'm asking for too much for some diversity with the representation that we get with Latina people. Like, we had Miles Morales in Into the Spider-Verse, the greatest Spider-Man movie of the 21st century. At me, I don't care. And I can't back this up with any concrete evidence. It's just what I think, is that the reason they race swapped America Chavez is that in the comics, America is sassy, headstrong, flirty, and buff. And they didn't want to play into any negative stereotypes that are already associated with black women, which may sound nice and noble. Like, if I can't do it right, then I'm not going to do it at all. Maybe they knew that between having a white writer and a white director, that they'd be scared of turning her into a caricature. Here's the thing about that. If you're scared about turning her into a caricature, just don't do that. Crazy concept. I know. Whoa. Maybe have some executives and maybe have some people on the casting crew that don't think Chipotle chicken is too hot. And then maybe you'll learn a thing or two about different cultures and how they act. Like, maybe if you can make a monster that goes around killing people seem sympathetic, then you have the range to extend that to other people. And yes, like, the thing is, we are getting some representation on the silver screen. Me being Mexican, I was happy to see somebody that looks more like me on the screen. And that's great. That's awesome. And if you feel seen by that, I don't want to take that away from you. But imagine how somebody else might feel. Another Black Latina person who has not really seen themselves except for Miles Morales in animated form or the video game. We shouldn't have this infighting. Like, a rising tide raises all ships, and a win for them is a win for us. A win for us is a win for them. Now, that being said, I am not an Afro-Latina person. I could never really go into the depths and seriousness of what it means to be that. So I'm not going to harp on this for too much longer. However, I do want to leave with this. Dr. C on TikTok, who summed up this entire, however long this rant ends up being, at least unedited. It's way too long. But I'm going to put this clip here. He also has a podcast, Office Hours with Dr. C. I very much encourage everyone to check it out.
See, in the Latina community, we have a large problem with colorism. Allow me to show you. See, this is a diagram of the racial social classes created by the Spanish and instituted throughout their colonies, including places like Puerto Rico, the territory that America is heavily associated with. And you can see on this chart that those that they classified as the mulattoes, who we will call now the Afro-Latinos, were placed beneath those of indigenous and Spanish descent, the mestizos, people like Xochitl Gomez or myself. And this unfortunate perspective is still alive and well in the Latina community and is embodied in phrases like mejora la raza, to better the race, which means to exclude black people.
What's done is done. This is our America Chavez. And so I want to present a change that I would have done into this movie to maybe make some people more excited for her as a spinoff, but also to give her some depth. And overall just make her like a more well-rounded character and like my little attempt at Monday morning quarterback with a screenplay. That doesn't really change too much of the movie. Editor's note, I realized that as I was editing this, I didn't talk about Rosario Dawson's character in Luke Cage, Daredevil, etc., all like the Netflix Marvel shows. And while yes, she is a very good representation of Afro-Latinidad, she very much is, one, in a supporting role, and two, technically not in the MCU proper. It's still very fluctuated and up in the air whether or not the Netflix shows are canon or whether they're going to be like a multiverse thing, and then when they get introduced to the main line, it's going to be a variant thing. It's very confusing and very much not in line with America Chavez's situation, but it would feel disingenuous and ironic that I made a video about black erasure and I excluded an Afro-Latina character that has been shown before. So Zoe Saldana and Rosario Dawson. So before the comments come in, I do want to say, yes, I know about her. Really, the only thing I want to change in Multiverse of Madness is to have this America Chavez have a relationship with New York. In the comics, America Chavez grows up in Washington Heights with the Santanas, and it very much is a defining feature of her. Like I said before, it is a found home that she has a complicated relationship with. She even bonds with Spider-Man over this. And the setup is already there. Like the fact that when they are jumping through dimensions, the very first thing that she does is go get pizza, and of all the locations in the different multiverses that she could have gone to, she ends up in New York, or New York, as they call it. And well, yes, the reason that they choose this setting is so that they can save on production costs because everything is green screen or blue screen. I honestly don't know the difference. I feel like I should learn the difference. It still is like, okay, you can use this to its narrative advantages. At the very least, I would have liked a reference to Washington Heights as like a little wink to the characters. Like, hey, we know what we fucked up, but hey, this is what we have. Especially because very recently, a movie that also took place in Washington Heights had a problem with black erasure and very bad colorism in it. Like I wrote the script. I had the thought of like, oh yeah, I had the connection of like, oh yeah, in the Heights, Washington Heights, this. But it just now, I'm reading the script, I'm like, oh man, that was bad. Yeah. And they made the same mistake twice. Usually you can learn from somebody else's mistake, but damn, they did not. So the change in action, specifically, I would want to add some dialogue. So after they do the obligatory Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell cameo, and America has eaten her pizza bowl, Doctor Strange starts asking some questions. You know, for somebody who can't control their powers, it's really lucky that we ended up here in New York. America laughs. You know, in every multiverse, I always end up in New York. The first time I did, I ended up in Washington Heights. This couple found me. They took me in. They gave me a blanket and an empanada. And they gave me this jacket. Boom. Tie it into your merch sales, Disney. Then she looks around all sad. And then Strange asks, what happened? And she goes, I was starting to feel happy and loved. I was starting to really like it there. But then I got scared. I was worried that I would forget my moms and that I would never find them again. I started to freak out. I panicked, and then a portal opened and it sucked me into another universe. And how many times has that happened? How many universes have you been to? Strange asks. 72? 73 if you count this one. And in all of them, I end up here. That's a lot of jumping around. A lot of leaving people behind, Strange says. Even if you add nothing else, even if she didn't have her powers or add anything else, like this kind of like adds a level of depth and sadness to her that you don't see in the original film, and really hints on something like abandonment issues that you could make people excited to see in future projects. Like, yeah, by the end of the movie, she's a badass, but after 20 something movies and shows, let's get out of the kiddie pool in terms of depth. And at the end, when Strange and her are talking and she's learning magic, he looks at her and says, what are you going to do? And she responds, I think I'll stick around for a while. I feel like I'm needed here. I think my moms will understand. You know, her mom's disappearing seems to be a big part of her motivation, if you can even call it that. But by the end of the movie, it seems like she just kind of forgot about it. Like, it is obviously, it's very much a Disney thing of it's never explicitly said that they're dead. She just says they're gone. But, you don't jump through 73 universes for the hell of it. You know, you're looking for somebody. So what, she's just not going to, did she just forget about them? With those very simple changes in dialogue, we did it, everyone. We cured racism. There will be no problems ever again in the future. No, look, I understand that movies are very difficult to make, and when something is passed through hundreds, if not thousands of people in order to make it work, pass an image through all that much, it's going to change along the way, and there's just so many moving parts. The fact that this movie got made at all is an impressive feat in and of itself. And so I don't want to disparage anyone's work on this movie, but hey, what is the internet for if not for Monday morning quarterbacking and looking back in hindsight about what should have been? When I first started writing this script and making the idea for this video, I wanted to do a whole thing about like what I would have changed, how like I would have had her powers be glitchy instead of not controlling them. I would have had some kind of hint towards her LGBT identity, and also making it so that her and Wanda have a relationship, have some kind of dynamic instead of just like being ethereal beings that fight at the end. But at some point I realized that I was just disparaging a movie for being a salad instead of a steak, and that what I wanted was just a completely different movie. And like I said earlier in the video, the MCU creates so much content that they could easily course correct. Like the fact that Thor went from being a Shakespearean bro to being one of the funniest characters in the MCU kind of gives me hope that, like, oh yeah, there's some things you can fix. The other stuff I stand by. Black erasure is bad. Stop doing that. I swear to God, if I ever make movies, I'm gonna start casting white Tinos and have them speak exclusively in Spanish. Like, did you know Sean from Psych is half Mexican? His name is James Rodriguez. And I just want to have him, but have him speak exclusively in Spanish. And